In 1875 Colorado, one lie destroyed a woman's life in minutes, but one cowboy's claim rebuilt it in seconds. When schoolteacher Eleanor Graves was falsely accused of carrying an illegitimate child, the richest rancher in 3 counties stepped forward and declared, "If she carries, it's mine." What happened next shocked an entire town and changed 2 lives forever. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled across the world. The morning of September 14th, 1875, began like any other in Copper Ridge, Colorado. Eleanor Graves woke before dawn in her small room above the milliner's shop, dressed in her simple gray teaching dress, pinned her dark hair into its customary neat bun, and walked the dusty 3 blocks to the schoolhouse with a stack of primers balanced against her hip. The mountain air was crisp and clean, touched with the scent of pine and the distant promise of early snow. She had no way of knowing that by noon, her entire life would be in ruins. Eleanor had been teaching in Copper Ridge for nearly 3 years. She'd arrived on the westbound stage in the spring of 1872, a young woman of 22 with good references from a Philadelphia normal school and enough determination to make up for her lack of family connections. The town had welcomed her cautiously at first. She was an outsider, after all, and Western towns in the 1870s didn't easily trust newcomers, especially unmarried women traveling alone. But Eleanor had proven herself through patient work. Her students learned to read and cipher. She organized spelling bees and recitation contests. She stayed out of gossip and politics, kept her reputation spotlessly clean, and slowly earned the respect of Copper Ridge's 300 residents. Or so she had thought. The first sign of trouble came when she reached the schoolhouse steps that morning and found the door already ajar. That was unusual. She always arrived first, always unlocked the door herself, always had the stove warming and the slates cleaned before the children arrived. Eleanor hesitated on the threshold, her instincts prickling with unease. Then she heard voices inside, women's voices, low and urgent. "I'm telling you, I saw it with my own eyes," came the unmistakable nasal tone of Martha Kane, the widow who ran the boarding house on Main Street. "She's been letting out her dresses, and she's got that look about her, all pale and queasy in the mornings." "Are you certain, Martha?" This was Prudence Whitmore, the banker's wife, her voice dripping with scandalized delight. "I mean, Eleanor Graves has always seemed so proper." "That's exactly what I'm saying," Martha replied, triumph sharpening her words. "It's always the proper ones who hide the worst secrets. Mark my words, that school teacher is with child, and there's no husband in sight." Eleanor's breath stopped in her throat. For a long moment, she stood frozen on the steps, the primers slipping from her grip and tumbling onto the wooden planks with a series of dull thuds. The voices inside ceased immediately. Then the door swung open, and Martha Kane's sharp face appeared, her eyes widening in false surprise that didn't quite mask the malicious satisfaction beneath. "Oh, Miss Graves, we were just... that is, we came to..." Martha stammered, but her voice carried clearly, ensuring that anyone within earshot could hear every word. "We were just discussing whether the school board ought to be informed about your condition." "My condition?" Eleanor's voice came out steady, but her hands trembled as she bent to retrieve the fallen book. "I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning, Mrs. Kane." Prudence Whitmore appeared behind Martha, her round face flushed with excitement. "Now, Eleanor, there's no use denying it. Martha has noticed the signs, and frankly, several of us have had our suspicions for weeks. If you find yourself in a delicate situation, the decent thing would be to resign your position before you corrupt the morals of the children." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. Pregnant. They thought she was pregnant. The accusation was so absurd, so completely detached from reality, that for a moment she could only stare at the 2 women in disbelief. She had never so much as been courted, had never allowed any man to take liberties, had guarded her reputation with almost obsessive care precisely because she knew how precarious her position was. "That is a lie," Eleanor said, her voice rising. "An absolute and complete lie. I don't know what has given you such a ridiculous notion, but I assure you..." "There's no need to shout, dear," Martha interrupted, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "We understand how distressing this must be, but the truth will out eventually. Better to face it with dignity than to make a spectacle." By now, several other people had gathered on the street, shopkeepers stepping out of their stores, early morning customers pausing with their parcels, children on their way to school stopping to stare. Eleanor felt their eyes on her like brands. She saw Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, press her handkerchief to her mouth in shock. She saw Thomas Garrett, who owned the general store, shake his head slowly. She saw young Billy Crawford nudge his friend and whisper something behind his hand. "This is insane," Eleanor said, her voice shaking now with both fear and fury. "Mrs. Kane, I don't know why you would spread such vicious lies, but..." "Lies?" Martha's voice rose to a shriek. "You dare call me a liar? I have eyes, Miss Graves. I've seen you leaving the schoolhouse late in the evenings. I've noticed how you refuse invitations to social gatherings. I've watched you turn pale at the breakfast table. Yes, even though you don't board with me anymore. Word gets around. A woman knows the signs." "The signs of what?" Eleanor demanded. "Of being tired from working 10 hours a day? Of preferring quiet evenings to meaningless social chatter? Of having a sensitive stomach? Mrs. Kane, you're inventing scandal where none exists." But even as she spoke, Eleanor could see the doubt in the faces around her. In a small town like Copper Ridge, reputation was everything. And once suspicion took root, it spread like poison through water. It didn't matter that the accusation was false. It didn't matter that she had done nothing wrong. What mattered was that Martha Kane had planted the seed, and the town was all too eager to watch it grow. "Perhaps we should let the doctor examine her," Prudence Whitmore suggested, her eyes gleaming. "Dr. Morrison could confirm whether..." "Absolutely not," Eleanor's voice cracked. "I will not submit to such humiliation based on the ravings of a spiteful woman. Mrs. Kane, I know exactly why you're doing this. Your nephew..." "Don't you dare bring Timothy into this," Martha hissed, stepping forward aggressively. "This has nothing to do with him." But it had everything to do with him, and Eleanor knew it. 3 months earlier, Martha's nephew, Timothy Kane, had begun paying unwanted attention to Eleanor. He was a lazy, shiftless man of 30 who had never held a job for more than a few weeks, and who spent most of his time drinking at the saloon and living off his aunt's charity. When Timothy had cornered Eleanor after church one Sunday and proposed marriage in terms that made it clear he saw her as a meal ticket rather than a romantic partner, she had refused him firmly and publicly. Martha had never forgiven the rejection. This was revenge. Pure, calculated revenge. "This has everything to do with Timothy," Eleanor said, her voice steadying as anger overcame fear. "You're trying to ruin me because I wouldn't marry your worthless nephew. You're spreading lies because I dared to refuse him." A murmur ran through the growing crowd. Several people exchanged glances. For a moment, Eleanor thought she might have turned the tide, might have made them see the truth. But then Martha played her final card. "Show them your dresses, Eleanor," Martha said softly, dangerously. "Show them how you've let out the seams. Show them the new apron you've been wearing to hide your thickening waist. Show them, and then call me a liar." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. It was true that she had let out her dresses, but only because she had lost weight over the summer when a bout of influenza had left her thin and weak. She had taken in the seams first, then let them back out as she recovered her health. And she had started wearing an apron over her dress simply because it was more practical for managing a classroom full of children. But Martha had twisted these innocent facts into damning evidence. "My clothing choices are none of your concern," Eleanor said. But her voice wavered, and she saw several people in the crowd shake their heads, their expressions hardening. "The school board will hear of this," Prudence Whitmore declared. "We cannot have such a person teaching our children." "She should be driven out of town," someone called from the back of the crowd. "Shameful," another voice agreed. "And her acting so high and mighty all this time?" Eleanor looked around wildly, searching for a single friendly face, a single person willing to speak in her defense. But she saw only judgment, suspicion, and the eager cruelty of people who had found an acceptable target for their collective righteousness. Even people she had thought of as friends avoided her gaze. "This is madness," Eleanor shouted, her voice breaking. "I have done nothing wrong. Nothing. I am not with child. I have never..." She choked on the words, unable to even speak the denial of intimacy in such a public setting. "How can you believe such lies?" "Perhaps you should leave Copper Ridge, Miss Graves," said a new voice. and Eleanor turned to see Sheriff Tom Bradley pushing through the crowd. He was a decent man, generally fair, but his face was troubled, and he wouldn't meet her eyes. At least until this matter is sorted out. Feelings are running high, and I can't guarantee your safety if you stay. My safety? Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. Sheriff, you know me. You know these accusations are false. I don't know anything for certain, Bradley said uncomfortably, but I do know that where there's smoke, there's usually fire. And I know that if you stay, there's going to be trouble. Best if you move on. Move on? Eleanor felt hysteria rising in her throat. This is my home. This is my job. You want me to run away because of lies? I want you to be sensible, the sheriff said firmly. Now I'm asking you politely to gather your things and leave town. If you don't, I may have to make it official. Eleanor opened her mouth to protest further, to shout her innocence to the uncaring sky, but the words died in her throat. She was beaten, and she knew it. In a small town in 1875, a woman's reputation was her only currency, and hers had just been destroyed. It didn't matter that the accusations were false. It didn't matter that she was innocent. What mattered was that the town had decided she was guilty, and nothing she could say would change their minds. She stood there in the dusty street, the September sun beating down on her head, her career in ruins, her life shattered, and rage and despair warring in her chest. She opened her mouth to scream her innocence one more time, to demand justice, to refuse to be driven out by lies and spite. And then a voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. If she carries, it's mine. The street went absolutely silent. The murmuring ceased. The accusations died on Martha Kane's lips. Every head turned toward the speaker. A man sat on a massive bay horse at the end of the street. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the practical clothes of a working rancher. Leather vest, worn shirt, dusty trousers, boots that had seen 1,000 miles. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his jaw strong and clean-shaven, his eyes a startling blue beneath the brim of his hat. He was perhaps 35 years old, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had never been ignored in his life. Eleanor had seen him before, of course. Everyone in Copper Ridge knew Luke Calhoun. He owned the Triple C Ranch, the largest and most successful cattle operation in 3 counties. He employed dozens of men, supplied beef to the army forts and mining camps, and had more money than most people could imagine. He was respected, even revered, and his word carried more weight than the mayors, the bankers, and the ministers combined. And he had just claimed responsibility for Eleanor's supposed pregnancy. Luke Calhoun dismounted with easy grace and walked toward the crowd. His spurs chimed softly with each step. People moved aside automatically, creating a path. He stopped directly in front of Eleanor, so close she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, and removed his hat. "Miss Graves," he said, his voice low and courteous, "I apologize for the distress this situation has caused you." Eleanor stared at him, unable to form words. She had never spoken to Luke Calhoun in her life. She had seen him at church occasionally, at town gatherings, riding through Copper Ridge with his men, but they moved in entirely different circles. He was wealthy and powerful. She was a school teacher who could barely afford to replace her worn boots. They had nothing in common, no connection, no reason for him to even know her name, and yet he had just claimed her non-existent child as his own. "Mr. Calhoun," Sheriff Bradley said, his voice uncertain, "are you saying that you and Miss Graves, that is, do you mean to tell us that you and she—" "I mean to tell you that if the lady is expecting a child, that child is mine," Luke said calmly, "and that any further gossip or harassment of Miss Graves will be dealt with as an insult to me personally. Is that clear?" The sheriff paled. Several people in the crowd took involuntary steps backward. An insult to Luke Calhoun was not something anyone in Copper Ridge wanted to risk. The man had the money to destroy businesses, the connections to ruin political careers, and the reputation for quiet ruthlessness when defending what was his. But Martha Kane spluttered, her face turning an ugly shade of red. "She never mentioned, there was never any indication that she and you—" "Miss Graves is a lady," Luke said, his voice hardening. "She guards her privacy and her dignity. Unlike some people in this town, she doesn't spread her personal business through the streets like manure." Martha's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Prudence Whitmore had gone white as chalk. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, several people trying to fade into the background now that the scandal had taken on such a different complexion. I think, Luke continued, his gaze sweeping over the assembled townspeople, that everyone here owes Miss Graves an apology. You've accused a decent woman of shameful behavior based on nothing but malicious gossip. You've tried to drive her from her home and her livelihood, and you've shown yourselves to be petty, cruel, and entirely too eager to believe the worst of someone who has done nothing but serve this community with dedication and grace. No one spoke. No one moved. The weight of Luke Calhoun's disapproval hung over the street like a storm cloud. Miss Graves, Luke said, turning back to Eleanor, offering his arm. May I escort you somewhere more private? I believe we have matters to discuss. Eleanor looked at his arm, then at his face, then at the crowd of people who moments before had been ready to destroy her. Her mind was reeling, unable to process what had just happened. This made no sense. None of it made any sense. But Luke Calhoun was offering her an escape, offering her protection, and she was in no position to refuse. Yes, she whispered. Thank you. She placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid strength of muscle beneath the fabric of his shirt. He led her through the silent crowd, helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. His arm came around her waist, steadying her, and then they were moving, the horse's hooves kicking up dust as they rode away from the schoolhouse, away from the crowd, away from the wreckage of Eleanor's life. Eleanor didn't look back. She kept her eyes fixed forward, her spine straight, her face a mask of control even as her heart hammered in her chest and her thoughts spun in useless circles. She could feel the eyes of the town boring into her back, could imagine the whispers already starting, the reinterpretation of the scandal now that Luke Calhoun had claimed involvement. They rode in silence for several minutes, heading out of town toward the open country. Finally, when the last buildings had disappeared behind them, and there was nothing but rolling grassland and distant mountains, Luke slowed the horse to a walk. You can let me down here, Eleanor said, her voice tight. I can walk back to town. Walk back to what? Luke asked. That mob? That pack of self-righteous hypocrites? They're my neighbors, Eleanor said, though the words tasted like ash. My students, my community. Your community just tried to run you out on a rail based on the ravings of a vindictive woman, Luke said flatly. Miss Graves, you can't go back there. Not now, not like this. I have nowhere else to go, Eleanor said, and to her horror her voice cracked. I have no family, no money saved. Everything I own is in my room above the milliner's shop. This is my home. It's all I have. You have your integrity, Luke said, and as of about 10 minutes ago, you have my protection. That's more than most people in Copper Ridge can claim. Eleanor twisted in the saddle to look at him. Why? She demanded. Why would you do that? You don't know me. We've never even spoken. Why would you claim responsibility for a pregnancy that doesn't even exist? Why would you lie for me? Luke's blue eyes met hers, and something in their depths made her breath catch. It wasn't desire, exactly, or pity. It was something darker and more complex. Old pain, old anger, and a fierce determination that bordered on obsession. Because I've seen what rumor can do to a woman, he said quietly. I've seen how a lie can destroy a life, and I swore I'd never stand by and watch it happen again. Your sister, Eleanor said, the words coming to her from some half-remembered piece of gossip. I heard once that you had a sister, that something happened. Her name was Sarah, Luke said, his voice going flat and distant. She was 17 years old. A boy in our town back in Texas spread a rumor that he'd been intimate with her. It wasn't true. Sarah had rebuffed his advances, and he wanted revenge. But the town believed him. They called her names. They shunned our family. My father tried to defend her, but words meant nothing against the tide of gossip. He paused, his jaw working. Sarah couldn't bear the shame. She hanged herself in the barn 3 weeks after the rumor started. Eleanor felt her throat close. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't bring her back, Luke said. And sorry doesn't erase the fact that I stood there, 18 years old and useless, watching my sister be destroyed by lies, and I did nothing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have the power, or the money, or the status to make them stop. His arm tightened slightly around Eleanor's waist. But I have all of those things now, and I cannot, stand by and watch another woman suffer what Sarah suffered, not when I have the power to prevent it. Eleanor stared at him, seeing the truth in every line of his face. This wasn't about her at all. She was simply the catalyst for a decades-old guilt and grief, a chance for Luke Calhoun to rewrite history, to save the sister he had lost by saving a stranger he didn't know. It should have offended her, perhaps. It should have made her angry that she was merely a stand-in for someone else's tragedy. But instead, she felt only a deep, weary gratitude. Whatever his motivations, Luke Calhoun had just saved her from a nightmare. He had given her what she needed most in that moment, a champion. "Where are you taking me?" Eleanor asked. "To my ranch," Luke said. "The Triple C. You'll be safe there." "I can't," Eleanor protested. "That would be... People will say whatever they're going to say, regardless of what you do," Luke interrupted. "Right now, the only thing that matters is keeping you safe and keeping your reputation from being completely destroyed. And the way we do that is by presenting a united front. As long as I acknowledge you, as long as I claim you as mine, no one in Copper Ridge will dare speak against you openly." "But the lie," Eleanor said, "the pregnancy. Eventually people will realize that I'm not actually expecting a child. What happens then?" Luke was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "We have some time before that becomes an issue. Right now, let's focus on getting you somewhere secure. We'll figure out the rest as we go." It wasn't much of a plan. It left 1,000 questions unanswered. But Eleanor was exhausted, emotionally battered, and out of options. So she nodded and let herself lean back slightly against Luke's solid chest as they rode toward the mountains and the unknown. The Triple C Ranch sprawled across a wide valley, about an hour's ride from Copper Ridge. Eleanor had heard about it, of course, everyone had, but she had never seen it up close. As they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, she caught her breath. The main house was built of honey-colored logs, 2 stories tall with a wide porch wrapping around all sides. Behind it stood a massive barn, several corrals, a bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. Cattle dotted the grassland as far as she could see, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Men moved among the buildings, working with practiced efficiency. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney. Dogs barked in greeting as Luke rode into the yard. It was more than a ranch. It was an empire. Luke dismounted and helped Eleanor down. Her legs trembled as her feet touched the ground. Whether from the ride or from emotional exhaustion, she couldn't tell. A woman emerged from the house, plump, gray-haired, with kind eyes, and a no-nonsense air about her. "Mrs. Ortega," Luke said, "this is Miss Eleanor Graves. She'll be staying with us for a while. Could you please prepare the guest room and see that she has everything she needs?" Ortega's eyes swept over Eleanor, taking in her pale face, her trembling hands, the wild look in her eyes that spoke of recent trauma. The older woman's expression softened immediately. "Of course, Mr. Luke," she said, her accent carrying the musical lilt of Spanish. "Come with me, mija. Let's get you settled." Eleanor allowed herself to be led into the house, through a large main room with comfortable furniture and walls lined with books, up a staircase to a sunny bedroom that was larger and better furnished than any place she had ever lived. Mrs. Ortega brought water for washing, helped her out of her dusty dress, and clucked sympathetically over the state of her undergarments. "You've had a bad time," Mrs. Ortega said. It wasn't a question. "But you're safe now. Mr. Luke, he doesn't bring people here unless he means to protect them. You rest now. I'll bring you something to eat." Left alone, Eleanor sank onto the bed and finally allowed herself to break down. "Great." Racking sobs tore from her chest. She cried for her lost position, for her shattered reputation, for the unfairness of it all. She cried for Luke's sister Sarah, dead 17 years, and for every other woman who had been destroyed by lies and gossip and the vicious pleasure people took in tearing others down. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she lay on the soft bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened and what would happen next. Outside, Luke Calhoun stood on his porch and stared toward Copper Ridge, his hands clenched into fists. He had meant every word he said to Eleanor. He would protect her. He would use every ounce of his power and influence to ensure that she didn't suffer Sarah's fate. But he hadn't told her the whole truth. He hadn't told her that he had noticed her months ago, had admired her quiet strength and dignity, had found himself drawn to her in a way he hadn't been drawn to any woman since his wife had died of fever 8 years before. He hadn't told her that when he heard Martha Kane's poisonous gossip in the general store that morning, something inside him had snapped, and he had acted on pure instinct. And he certainly hadn't told her that the lie he had just told, that if she carried a child it was his, had awakened something in him that he thought long dead. A wanting. A fierce, protective possessiveness that had nothing to do with guilt over Sarah and everything to do with Eleanor herself. Luke Calhoun was a patient man. He had built his empire through careful planning and strategic thinking. He could wait. He could give Eleanor time to recover, to trust him, to see that his protection came with no ugly strings attached. But he also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that Eleanor Graves was not going to be a temporary guest at the Triple C. One way or another, she was going to be his. The sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. As inside the ranch house, two damaged souls began the uncertain process of figuring out what came next. Eleanor woke to unfamiliar sounds, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the creak of wooden beams settling, the soft murmur of Spanish voices somewhere below. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day crashed over her like a wave, and she buried her face in the pillow, fighting the urge to cry again. Sunlight streamed through the window, bright and merciless. She had slept in her chemise, too exhausted to do more than collapse onto the bed after Mrs. Ortega had left. Now she sat up slowly, her body aching as though she had been beaten. In a way, she supposed she had been. A knock at the door made her jump. "Miss Eleanor?" Mrs. Ortega's voice came through the wood, gentle but firm. "I have breakfast and some clothes for you. May I come in?" Eleanor pulled the sheet around herself. "Yes, please." Mrs. Ortega entered carrying a tray laden with eggs, toast, bacon, and coffee. Behind her came a younger woman, a Mexican girl of perhaps 16, carrying a bundle of fabric. They set everything on a small table by the window, and Mrs. Ortega turned to Eleanor with a practiced, assessing eye. "You're about the same size as Mr. Luke's late wife," the housekeeper said matter-of-factly. "He said you could wear her things until we can get you your own. Rosa here is a fine seamstress. She'll let out or take in whatever needs adjusting." Eleanor's throat tightened. "That's very kind, but I couldn't possibly—" "You can, and you will," Mrs. Ortega interrupted, not unkindly. "You need clothes, and these are just gathering dust in trunks. Margaret would have wanted them used. She was a practical woman." The housekeeper's expression softened. "Eat first, then we'll see about making you presentable. Mr. Luke wants to speak with you before noon." After the women left, Eleanor forced herself to eat, though the food tasted like sawdust in her mouth. She couldn't stop thinking about wearing a dead woman's clothes, about accepting charity from a man she didn't know, about the impossible situation she had found herself in. But what choice did she have? She couldn't go back to Copper Ridge, not after yesterday's humiliation. She had perhaps $20 in savings, not enough to get her to another town, let alone establish herself there. She was trapped by circumstance and dependent on Luke Calhoun's inexplicable generosity. The dress Rosa had left was a simple calico and a soft blue, worn but well made. It fit reasonably well, though it was slightly loose in the waist and tight across the shoulders. Eleanor twisted her hair into a braid, splashed water on her face, and tried to compose herself. When she finally descended the stairs, she felt like an imposter playing at being someone she was not. Luke was waiting in what appeared to be a study, a room lined with ledgers and maps, dominated by a large oak desk covered in papers. He stood when she entered, his expression unreadable. "Miss Graves," he said, "I trust you slept well?" "As well as could be expected given the circumstances," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice level. "Mr. Calhoun, I owe you tremendous gratitude for what you did yesterday, but I must understand—" "Sit down," Luke interrupted, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. "Please, we have a great deal to discuss." Eleanor sat, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. Luke remained standing, moving to the window where he could look out over his land. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Eleanor found herself studying him in the morning light. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 32 or 33 rather than 35. There was silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, but his face, though weathered, was still youthful. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. Yet there was something almost melancholy in the set of his shoulders. "I spoke with my lawyer this morning," Luke said finally, still gazing out the window. "His name is James Hartwell. He practices in Denver but handles all my legal affairs. I sent a writer before dawn." "A lawyer?" Eleanor echoed, confused. "Why would we need to sue Martha Kane for slander?" Luke said, turning to face her. His blue eyes were hard as flint. "To make an example of her so thorough that no one in Copper Ridge will ever dare speak your name with anything but respect." Eleanor's breath caught. "Mr. Calhoun, I don't think—" "That woman deliberately tried to destroy your life," Luke continued, his voice controlled but vibrating with anger. "She spread vicious lies with the intent of causing you harm. In a civilized society, there are consequences for such actions. I intend to see that she faces them." "But a lawsuit," Eleanor protested. "That would be expensive. It would take time, and it would keep the scandal alive. Keep people talking about—" "People are already talking," Luke said flatly. "They'll talk whether we sue or not. The difference is whether we control the narrative or let Martha Kane control it. If we sue, we force the truth into the open. We make her prove her accusations or admit she lied. Either way, your name gets cleared." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "You don't understand how small towns work, Mr. Calhoun. A lawsuit won't clear my name. It will just give people more to gossip about. They'll say I'm vindictive, that I'm hiding something, that... They'll say whatever they want, regardless of what you do," Luke interrupted, echoing his words from the previous day. "But if we sue, at least we fight back. At least we show that there are costs to destroying an innocent woman's reputation." "At what cost to you?" Eleanor demanded, finding her voice at last. "You've already claimed responsibility for a non-existent pregnancy. If we pursue this lawsuit, you'll be dragged into it. Your name will be connected to mine. People will ask questions. They'll wonder why you're so invested in defending me. And when no child materializes, they'll know you lied." Luke's expression didn't change. "I'm aware of the risks." "Are you?" Eleanor stood, her hands clenched into fists. "Are you truly? Because I don't think you've thought this through. You're a wealthy, powerful man. You're accustomed to solving problems with money and influence. But this isn't that kind of problem. This is my life, my reputation, and I will not have you making decisions about it without consulting me." For the first time since she had met him, Luke Calhoun smiled. It was a small smile, barely more than a quirk at the corner of his mouth, but it transformed his face. "You're right," he said. "I apologize. I'm used to giving orders and having them followed. It's a bad habit." He gestured to the chair. "Please, sit down. Let's discuss this properly." Eleanor sat, somewhat mollified by his acknowledgement. Luke moved to his desk and pulled out a folder. "Here's what Hartwell says," he began, opening the folder. "We have a strong case for slander. Martha Kane made false statements about you that damaged your reputation and your livelihood. We have witnesses to her accusations. We can demonstrate financial harm. You lost your teaching position. The problem, as you correctly identified, is the pregnancy claim. If we pursue a lawsuit, we'll eventually have to address the fact that you're not actually with child." "Which means admitting that you lied," Eleanor said, "which damages your reputation and makes you look like a fool for claiming a child that doesn't exist." Luke nodded slowly. Unless what?" He looked at her directly, his blue eyes intense. "Unless we get married." The words hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon?" "Married," Luke repeated calmly. "It's the only way to make the situation sustainable. If we marry, then my claim yesterday makes sense. The pregnancy rumor becomes moot. Either you are with child and it's legitimate because we're married, or you're not. And it was simply malicious gossip that forced us to acknowledge our relationship prematurely. Either way, your reputation is protected and mine remains intact." Eleanor felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her. "You can't be serious." "I'm entirely serious. Luke set the folder aside and leaned forward, his elbows on his desk. Miss Graves, Eleanor, I know this seems sudden and strange, but consider the practical reality. You have no home, no income, and a reputation that's been destroyed. I have wealth, power, and influence, but I've just publicly claimed you as mine. If you leave the Triple C, if you try to start over somewhere else, the questions will follow you. People will wonder why I let you go. They'll assume the worst. But if we marry, everything makes sense. It becomes a love story instead of a scandal. A love story, Eleanor repeated numbly, between two people who barely know each other. Marriages have been built on less, Luke said quietly. And we'd have time to know each other. I'm not proposing we marry tomorrow. I'm suggesting we announce an engagement, a brief courtship for the sake of appearances. And then in a few weeks or months, a wedding. By the time we actually marry, the gossip will have died down, Martha Kane will have been discredited, and you'll have the protection of my name permanently. Eleanor stood abruptly and walked to the window, her mind reeling. Everything he said made a horrible kind of sense. She was ruined in Copper Ridge, and small-town gossip traveled. Even if she went to Denver or San Francisco, questions would follow her. Why had she left her teaching position? Why had a wealthy rancher publicly claimed her? The scandal would cling to her like a stain. But if she married Luke Calhoun, if she became Mrs. Luke Calhoun, wife of one of the most respected men in Colorado, that was a different story entirely. That was respectability. That was protection. But it was also a lie. I won't marry you, Eleanor said, not turning around. I'm grateful for your help, truly I am. But I won't trap you in a marriage you don't want just to salvage my reputation. Who says I don't want it? Luke's voice was closer now. He had stood and moved toward her. Eleanor, look at me. She turned slowly. He was only a few feet away, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver in his stubble, the quiet intensity in his gaze. I'm 33 years old, Luke said. I've been a widower for 8 years. In that time, I've built an empire, made myself wealthy beyond anything I imagined as a boy in Texas. But I'm alone. The ranch runs smoothly, my bank accounts grow, and I come home every night to an empty house. Mrs. Ortega cooks my meals and Rosa cleans my rooms, and I sit in that study for hours working on ledgers because there's nothing else to do. No family, no children, no future beyond making money. That's not my problem to solve, Eleanor said, but her voice lacked conviction. No, Luke agreed, it's not. But neither is your situation mine to solve, and yet here we are. Eleanor, I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not even asking you to like me particularly, though I hope you will in time. I'm asking you to be practical. We can help each other. I need a wife, someone to run this household, someone to give me a reason to build something beyond wealth. You need protection, security, a future. We can provide those things for each other. Without love, Eleanor said. You're proposing a business arrangement. I'm proposing a partnership, Luke corrected. One based on mutual respect and mutual benefit. Love, if it comes, will be a bonus. But I won't lie to you and pretend I'm swept away by romance. I admire you. I respect your strength and your intelligence. I think we could build a good life together. That's all I'm offering and all I'm asking in return. Eleanor wanted to refuse. Every fiber of her being rebelled against the idea of marrying a stranger, of accepting what amounted to charity dressed up as partnership. She had always imagined that if she married, it would be for love, real love, the kind her parents had shared before fever took them both when she was 16. She had imagined a man who courted her properly, who knew her heart, who chose her for herself rather than for convenience. But those had been the dreams of a girl who still believed the world was fair. The woman she had become knew better. The world was harsh and arbitrary, and survival often meant making choices that pride and principle couldn't afford. I need time, Eleanor said finally. I can't make such a decision in a single morning. Luke nodded. Of course, take all the time you need. In the meantime, you're welcome to stay here as my guest. No obligations, no pressure. Just think about it. Eleanor studied his face, searching for any sign of ulterior motive, any hint of the kind of predatory intent she had learned to recognize in men. But Luke's expression remained open and honest, his eyes clear. Whatever his reasons for offering marriage, they seemed to be exactly what he had stated. Practical, strategic, and born of some need she couldn't fully understand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I will think about it." The days that followed took on a strange, suspended quality. Eleanor remained at the Triple C, occupying the guest room that had once belonged to Luke's wife, Mrs. Ortega treated her with kind efficiency. Rosa altered more dresses to fit her, and the ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully when she ventured outside. She was given free run of the house and grounds, but asked for nothing, uncertain of her status, guest, charity case, or something else entirely. Luke himself was often absent during the day, riding out to check on his herds or meeting with his foreman about ranch business. But every evening he returned for dinner, and every evening he and Eleanor ate together at the long table in the dining room, Mrs. Ortega serving them courses that seemed absurdly elaborate for just two people. At first their conversations were stiff and formal. Eleanor couldn't shake the sense that she was play-acting at being someone she wasn't, wearing dead woman's dresses and eating in a rich man's house, while her real life lay in ruins back in Copper Ridge. But gradually, as the days passed, the awkwardness began to ease. Luke was surprisingly easy to talk to. He was well-read. The shelves she had noticed on her first day were filled with everything from agricultural treatises to poetry, and he seemed genuinely interested in her opinions on everything from Shakespeare to the territorial government. "You're not what I expected," Eleanor said one evening, perhaps a week after her arrival. They had finished dinner and were sitting in the main room, Eleanor in an armchair with a book, and Luke at his desk reviewing accounts. The comment slipped out before she could stop it. Luke looked up, his expression curious. "What did you expect?" Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "I don't know exactly. Someone more rough, I suppose. You're a cattleman. I expected someone who talked about nothing but beef prices and grazing rights." Luke smiled, that small quirk of his mouth that Eleanor was beginning to recognize. "I do talk about beef prices and grazing rights. Extensively. You've just been fortunate enough to avoid those conversations so far." He set down his pen. "My father was a rancher, but my mother was a school teacher. She insisted I read properly, speak properly, think properly. She said there was no reason a man who worked with cattle couldn't also work with ideas. She sounds like a wise woman." "She was." Luke's expression grew distant. "She died when I was 20, cholera. She and Sarah both went within days of each other. My father lasted another 5 years, but I don't think he ever recovered from losing them." He paused. "That's why I left Texas. Too many ghosts." Eleanor set her book aside. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring up painful memories." "Don't apologize." Luke stood and moved to the window, a habit she had noticed he had when discussing difficult subjects. "I told you about Sarah because it was relevant, but I didn't tell you about my mother, and I should have. You should know who I come from if we're considering moving forward." "Tell me about your wife," Eleanor heard herself say. "Margaret. Mrs. Ortega mentioned her, and I'm wearing her clothes, but I don't know anything about her." Luke was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Margaret was a good woman, the daughter of a banker in Denver. Our marriage was arranged by our fathers, a business alliance more than a romance, though we grew fond of each other over time. She was delicate, not really suited to ranch life. She tried, but she was often ill. When the fever came, she didn't have the strength to fight it." He turned to face Eleanor. "I cared for her. I grieved her. But I won't pretend our marriage was a great love story. It was comfortable, companionable. We respected each other, but we were never truly intimate in the way I think marriages should be." "And that's what you're offering me," Eleanor said. "Comfortable, companionable." "I'm offering you honesty," Luke said. "I'm offering you a partnership where we're both clear about expectations. Margaret and I never had that. We both played roles we thought we should play, the devoted husband, the perfect wife, but we never really knew each other. I don't want that again. If you marry me, Eleanor, I want us to be honest with each other, about everything." Eleanor met his gaze. "Even when honesty is uncomfortable?" "Especially then." She stood and walked toward him, stopping a few feet away. "Then I'll be honest with you now. I'm terrified. I'm terrified of staying here, of accepting your charity, of becoming dependent on you. But I'm even more terrified of leaving, of trying to rebuild my life somewhere else with no money, no references, and a reputation that will follow me wherever I go. You're offering me security, and I desperately need security. But I'm afraid that if I accept, I'll lose the last shred of independence I have. I'll become Mrs. Luke Calhoun, and Eleanor Graves will cease to exist. Luke considered this for a moment. Then he said, "What if I promised you that wouldn't happen? What if I promised you that as my wife, you would have freedom? You could continue teaching if you wanted. I could build a school here on the ranch for the children of my workers. You could have your own money, your own accounts. You could come and go as you pleased, pursue your own interests. I don't want to own you, Eleanor. I want a partner, not a possession." "You say that now?" Eleanor said. "But marriage gives you legal rights over me. Everything I own would become yours. I would have no recourse if you changed your mind about all these generous promises." "Then we'll put it in writing," Luke said immediately. "Hartwell can draw up an agreement. You'll have a separate allowance, control over your own funds, freedom to leave if you choose. I'll make sure you're protected legally as well as practically." Eleanor stared at him. "You would do that?" "Most men would be insulted at the suggestion." "Most men are fools," Luke said bluntly. "I'm asking you to take an enormous risk by marrying a man you barely know. The least I can do is minimize that risk however I can. Besides," he smiled slightly, "if I have to rely on legal ownership rather than your actual desire to stay, I've already failed as a husband." Despite everything, Eleanor felt herself smile back. "You're a strange man, Luke Calhoun." "So I've been told." He extended his hand. "Will you at least consider it? A true engagement, one where we take time to know each other before we make any final decisions? If at any point you want to back out, you can. I give you my word." Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand. This was insane. This was a fairy tale and a business proposition all mixed together, and it made no logical sense, but neither did anything else in her life at the moment. And there was something deeply appealing about Luke's straightforward approach, his refusal to dress up practical necessity in romantic pretense. She took his hand. His grip was warm and firm, calloused from work but gentle. "A courtship," she agreed, "a real one, where we're honest with each other and see if this might actually work. But Luke, if I do this, if I agree to marry you, I need you to understand something." "What's that?" "I won't be a decoration. I won't be the pretty wife who sits in the parlor and entertains guests and has no thoughts of her own. If I'm going to be Mrs. Luke Calhoun, I'm going to be a true partner. That means you listen to my opinions even when you disagree. That means I have a say in decisions that affect both of us. That means you treat me as an equal, not as something you rescued and now possess." Luke's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "I wouldn't want anything less." They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, an agreement made that was both more and less than a traditional engagement. Then Luke released her hand and stepped back, and the spell was broken. "I'll ride into town tomorrow," he said. "I need to meet with the sheriff about the legal case against Martha Kane, and I think it would be good to make our engagement public, give people something new to talk about." "They'll already be talking," Eleanor said dryly. "I'm sure everyone in Copper Ridge knows I'm here." "Let them talk," Luke said. "This time, we'll control what they're saying." The next morning, Luke rode out early. Eleanor watched from the porch as he departed, sitting tall in the saddle, every inch the powerful rancher. Mrs. Ortega came to stand beside her, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's a good man," the housekeeper said quietly. "The best I've ever known. Whatever you decide, Miss Eleanor, you should know that." "You loved her," Eleanor said suddenly. "Margaret, his first wife. Were you here when she died?" Mrs. Ortega nodded. "I was here. I nursed her through that terrible fever, watched her slip away despite everything we tried. It broke Mr. Luke's heart, though he didn't show it much. He threw himself into work, building this empire like he could wall out grief with success." She glanced at Eleanor. "You're different from her, stronger, more fire in you. I think maybe that's what he needs." "I'm not here to heal him," Eleanor said. "I'm here because I have nowhere else to go." "Maybe," Mrs. Ortega allowed. "But maybe healing happens anyway, whether we plan for it or not." Luke returned late in the afternoon, his expression grim. Eleanor met him in the study, where he poured himself a whiskey before speaking. "It's worse than I thought," he said finally. "Martha Kane has half the town convinced that you're a fallen woman who seduced me into claiming your bastard. The other half thinks I'm a fool who's been trapped by a scheming opportunist. The school board has officially terminated her employment and is discussing whether to press charges for moral corruption." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Charges? On what ground?" "They don't need grounds," Luke said bitterly. "They just need the will to destroy you, and Martha has given them that. She's turned this into a crusade. She's got Prudence Whitmore and several other women organizing a petition to have you run out of the county entirely." "Then I'll leave," Eleanor said, her voice hollow. "I'll go to California or back east. I'll disappear, and you can..." "No." Luke set down his glass with enough force that the whiskey sloshed. "Absolutely not. That's exactly what they want, for you to slink away in shame and prove them right. We're not giving them that satisfaction." "Then what do you suggest?" Luke crossed to her, his eyes blazing with determination. "We fight. We announce our engagement publicly and loudly. We make it clear that I'm not some fool who got trapped. I'm a man who chose you deliberately and will defend that choice against anyone who questions it. And we make Martha Kane regret the day she decided to spread her poison." "How?" "I spoke to Hartwell. He says we have multiple options. We can sue for slander, as I mentioned. But we can also go after her for damages. You lost your job, your reputation, your livelihood because of her lies. We can make this expensive for her, expensive enough that others will think twice before engaging in similar behavior." Eleanor shook her head. "That will take months, maybe years. And in the meantime, I'm trapped here, dependent on you, while everyone in town believes the worst about me." "Not everyone." Luke pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "Sheriff Bradley gave me this. It's a letter signed by 15 of your former students and their parents. They're attesting to your good character and asking that you be reinstated to your teaching position." Eleanor took the paper with shaking hands. She recognized the names: the Hendersons, the Garcias, the Morrison family, even old Mrs. Walsh, whose grandson had struggled with reading until Eleanor spent extra hours tutoring him. Her eyes burned as she read their words of support. "They believe in you," Luke said softly. "Not everyone has been poisoned by Martha's lies, and those people will stand with us if we give them the chance." Eleanor looked up at him through tears. "Why are you doing this? Why fight so hard for me?" Luke reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "Because I've watched too many good people be destroyed by lies and cowardice. Because you deserve better, and because..." He hesitated, then continued. "Because when I saw you standing in that street yesterday, facing down that mob with your head high, even though you were terrified, I saw someone worth fighting for. Someone worth fighting alongside." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some barrier she had been holding up beginning to crack. "I'm still afraid," she whispered. "So am I," Luke admitted. "But we'll be afraid together. That's better than being afraid alone." He was standing close now, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell leather and sage and something indefinably masculine. For a wild moment, she wanted to lean into him, to let herself be held, to accept the comfort and strength he was offering. But she held herself still, uncertain if she had the right to that kind of intimacy with a man who was still essentially a stranger. Luke seemed to sense her hesitation. He stepped back, giving her space. "I won't rush you," he said. "Take all the time you need. But Eleanor, I meant what I said. We're in this together now, for however long you'll have me." That night, Eleanor lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. In less than 2 days, her entire life had been upended, destroyed, and rebuilt into something utterly unrecognizable. She had gone from independent school teacher to dependent charity case to prospective wife of a wealthy rancher. It was absurd. It was terrifying. And yet, lying there in the darkness, she couldn't deny the small spark of hope that had taken root somewhere in her chest. Hope that maybe, just maybe, something good could come from this disaster. Hope that Luke Calhoun was exactly what he appeared to be, a decent man offering genuine partnership. Hope that she could find a way to rebuild not just her reputation, but her life, into something stronger than before. Outside her window, the Colorado night was vast and starlit. Somewhere in the darkness, Cattle grazed and night birds called, and the world turned on its axis, regardless of human drama. Eleanor closed her eyes and made herself a promise. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the same strength Luke had recognized in her. She would not be a victim. She would not let Martha Kane or anyone else write the story of her life. She would write it herself, one difficult choice at a time. Morning came with the sound of hammering. Eleanor dressed quickly and descended the stairs to find Luke already gone, his place at the breakfast table empty. Mrs. Ortega was unusually quiet as she served coffee and eggs, her movements brisk and efficient, but her eyes troubled. "Where is Mr. Calhoun?" Eleanor asked, settling into her chair. "He rode out before dawn," Mrs. Ortega replied. "Said he had business in town that couldn't wait." She hesitated, then added, "He took 6 of his men with him, armed." Eleanor's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. "Armed? Why would he—" "Because Martha Kane's nephew Timothy showed up at the Triple C gate last night, drunk and making threats," the housekeeper said flatly. "One of the night hands sent him packing, but Mr. Luke doesn't take threats lightly, not when they're directed at his people." "His people?" Eleanor repeated softly. The phrase settled over her like a cloak, protective, possessive, and strangely comforting. She was one of Luke's people now, whether she had fully accepted it or not. And that meant something in this harsh territory where loyalty and protection were currencies more valuable than gold. She was still sitting there, her breakfast cooling on her plate, when the sound of approaching horses drew her to the window. But it wasn't Luke returning. Instead, a fine carriage pulled by matched grays rolled into the yard, and a distinguished man in an expensive suit climbed down, carrying a leather satchel. Mrs. Ortega appeared at Eleanor's elbow. "That's Mr. Hartwell, the lawyer from Denver. Mr. Luke must have sent for him specially." She smoothed her apron. "You'd best receive him in the study, Miss Eleanor. It's proper." Eleanor's heart hammered as she made her way to the study. She had never dealt with lawyers before. In her world, lawyers meant trouble, debt collection, or the administration of dead people's meager estates. But when James Hartwell entered the room, removing his hat with a courteous bow, his expression was kind rather than intimidating. "Miss Graves, I presume," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education. "Luke has told me a great deal about you. I'm here to discuss the legal situation and to prepare some documents for your protection." "My protection?" Eleanor gestured for him to sit, then took her own seat behind Luke's massive desk, feeling like a child playing at being important. Hartwell opened his satchel and withdrew several folders. "Luke is a cautious man, Miss Graves, and a fair one. He's asked me to prepare 2 sets of documents. The first is a prenuptial agreement that guarantees you financial independence should you choose to marry him. The second is a contract of employment that gives you the position of teacher at a new school he intends to build on Triple C land, with a salary and terms that ensure you're compensated fairly regardless of your marital status." Eleanor stared at the papers he spread before her. "He's building a school?" "He sent orders to the lumber mill this morning," Hartwell confirmed. "A proper schoolhouse with living quarters attached if you want them. He's also drafting a letter to the families of his ranch hands, informing them that education will be provided free of charge to all children on Triple C property." The lawyer's eyes crinkled with what might have been approval. "Luke Calhoun is many things, Miss Graves, but indecisive is not one of them. When he commits to a course of action, he commits fully." Eleanor's hands trembled as she picked up the first document. The prenuptial agreement was written in dense legal language, but Hartwell patiently explained each clause. She would have her own bank account, her own income from teaching, and the right to property in her own name. If the marriage ended for any reason, she would receive a settlement that would support her comfortably for years. If Luke died first, she would inherit a substantial portion of the estate outright, not merely as a trust. "This is extraordinary," Eleanor whispered. "Most men would never agree to such terms." "Luke is not most men," Hartwell said simply. "He saw what happened to his mother when his father died. The estate was tied up in probate for 2 years, and she had to fight his father's creditors for every penny. Luke swore he would never put a wife in that position." He paused. "He also asked me to add a clause about annulment. If you decide within the first year of marriage that you've made a mistake, you can have the marriage dissolved without contest, and you'll still receive the settlement. He wants you to know you have an escape route if you need it. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. He's thought of everything. He's thought of your dignity and your future, Hartwell corrected gently, which is more than most women in your position could hope for. My advice, Miss Graves, speaking not as his lawyer, but as someone who has known Luke Calhoun for 8 years, if you have any doubt about his character or his intentions, set it aside. He's as honorable a man as I've ever met. But he barely knows me, Eleanor protested. Why would he bind himself to such generous terms for someone he barely knows? Hartwell began gathering the papers. Perhaps you should ask him that yourself. But if I may offer an observation, Luke has been alone for a long time. Not physically alone. He has employees and associates aplenty, but alone in the ways that matter. He's a man who's built an empire but has no one to share it with, no one to build for. I think he sees in you something worth building for. And for a man like Luke, that's worth any price. After Hartwell departed with promises to return within the week with finalized documents, Eleanor wandered through the ranch house in a daze. She found herself in a room she hadn't explored before, a small parlor filled with afternoon light. The furniture was covered with dust sheets, as though this space had been closed off for years. When she pulled back one sheet, she found an upright piano, its wood gleaming beneath a layer of dust. Unable to resist, Eleanor sat on the bench and lifted the cover. The keys were yellowed with age, but still true when she pressed them experimentally. She began to play, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. A Mozart sonata her mother had taught her years ago. The music filled the empty room, sweet and sad and achingly familiar. She was so absorbed in playing that she didn't hear Luke return until his voice spoke from the doorway. "Margaret never learned to play," he said quietly. "The piano was her mother's, sent here when she died. I kept meaning to have it tuned, but somehow I never did." Eleanor's hands stilled on the keys. She turned to find Luke leaning against the doorframe, his hat in his hands, his expression unreadable. There was dust on his clothes and a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there that morning. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said quickly. "I shouldn't have presumed—" "Don't apologize," Luke interrupted. "It's good to hear music in this house again. It's been too quiet for too long." He moved into the room, pulling the dust sheets off the other furniture with efficient movements. This was Margaret's favorite room. She'd sit here for hours reading or doing needlework. After she died, I couldn't stand to come in here, so I closed it up and pretended it didn't exist. Eleanor rose from the piano bench. "What happened in town?" Luke's expression darkened. "Timothy Kane is a coward and a fool. He was making big talk at the saloon last night about defending his aunt's honor and teaching me a lesson. When I showed up this morning with 6 armed men, he suddenly remembered pressing business elsewhere. He tossed his hat onto a chair. The sheriff had a talk with him, made it clear that if he comes near you or makes any more threats, he'll spend the next 6 months in jail. Martha herself was notably absent. Apparently she's taken to her bed with a sick headache. In other words, hiding, Eleanor said. In other words, realizing that she's overplayed her hand, Luke corrected. Hartwell paid a visit to her lawyer this morning, making it clear that we intend to pursue every legal remedy available. Her lawyer is a sensible man who knows a losing case when he sees one. I expect we'll hear settlement overtures within the week. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out over the ranch lands. This is happening so fast. A week ago, I was a school teacher living a quiet, ordinary life. Now I'm at the center of a legal battle, living in a rich man's house, contemplating marriage to a stranger. "I'm not a stranger anymore," Luke said, coming to stand beside her. "Or at least I'm trying not to be." "Hartwell told you about the school?" "He did." "Luke, you don't have to." "I want to," he said firmly. "It's not charity, Eleanor. It's practical. I've got 40 families working on this ranch. Most of them have children who are growing up illiterate because the nearest school is 6 miles away in Copper Ridge, and most of their parents can't afford to send them. A school here makes sense for the ranch, for the community. The fact that it also gives you independence and purpose is just good planning." Eleanor turned to face him fully. "You're a very unusual man, Luke Calhoun. So you keep telling me." He smiled slightly. "Does that mean you're leaning toward accepting my proposal?" "I'm leaning toward believing that you're sincere in your intentions," Eleanor said carefully. "But marriage is an enormous step. I need to know more about what you expect from a wife, what our daily life would look like, whether you have any habits that might drive me to murder." Luke laughed, a real laugh that transformed his usually serious face. Fair questions all. Let me see, I wake early and ride out to check the herds most mornings. I keep accounts in the evening. I don't drink to excess, gamble, or keep mistresses. I expect good food and a well-run household, but I don't micromanage how it's accomplished. I have a temper, but I've never raised my hand to anyone weaker than myself. I snore occasionally, but not egregiously. Is that sufficient, or should I provide character references? Despite herself, Eleanor smiled. References might be helpful. Mrs. Ortega speaks highly of you, but she's biased. I'll have my men write testimonials, Luke said solemnly, though his eyes glinted with humor. Though fair warning, most of them will focus on my abilities as a rancher rather than as a potential husband. They stood there in the dusty parlor, sunlight streaming through the windows, and Eleanor felt something shift between them. The awkwardness that had characterized their early interactions was fading, replaced by something more comfortable. Not quite friendship, not yet intimacy, but a tentative partnership built on mutual respect and surprising humor. I have questions too, Luke said after a moment. Things I need to know about you if we're going to make this work. Ask, Eleanor said, bracing herself. Do you want children? The question caught her off guard. She had expected queries about housekeeping or social graces, not something so fundamental and personal. Yes, she said slowly. I've always loved teaching children, being around them. I think I would like to have my own someday, but I understand if you don't want more, you're already building an empire, as Hartwell said. I want children, Luke said quietly. I wanted them with Margaret, but she was too frail, and then she was gone. I'm not getting any younger, Eleanor. If I'm going to have a family, I need to start building it now. But I need to know that you want that too, that you're not just agreeing to this marriage as a practical arrangement, but that you can envision a real future. Children, grandchildren, a legacy. Eleanor's breath caught. You're talking about a real marriage then, not just a partnership of convenience. A partnership can be real, Luke said, can be more real sometimes than marriages built on nothing but passion. Passion fades. Mutual respect, shared goals, companionship, those things last. He reached out and gently took her hand. I'm not asking you to love me right now, Eleanor, but I'm asking if you think you could someday. If you think we could build something genuine together. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused, hers small and ink-stained from years of teaching. I don't know, she said honestly. I've never been in love. I've never been courted properly. I don't know if what you're describing is possible or if I'm even capable of it. Then let's find out, Luke said. Together. No more pressure, no more rush to decide. Let's spend time together. Let's talk, ride, work side by side. Let's see if this partnership we're building can become something more. A courtship, Eleanor said. A real courtship, not just an arrangement. A real courtship, Luke agreed. Though I should warn you, I'm rusty at courting. It's been 15 years since I wooed Margaret, and even then I wasn't particularly skilled at it. Eleanor found herself smiling. Then we'll both be learning as we go. The next week passed in a strange, sweet blur. Luke made good on his promise to court Eleanor properly. He brought her wildflowers from the high meadows, not cultivated roses, but fierce, beautiful blooms that survived in harsh mountain soil. He took her riding through the ranch land, showing her the springs where his cattle watered, the hidden valleys where calves were born in spring, the line shacks where his men stayed during winter storms. He taught her to read the land the way he did, to see the subtle signs of weather changes and animal movement that meant the difference between prosperity and disaster. In the evenings, they sat together in the parlor that was no longer dusty and closed off. Eleanor played the piano, Luke had brought a tuner from Denver, and Luke read aloud from the books he loved. Sometimes they talked for hours, about everything and nothing. Luke told her about building the Triple C from a small land claim into an empire. Eleanor told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, her parents' death, her determination to make her own way in the world. You were brave, Luke said one evening after she had finished describing how she had used her parents' small life insurance to attend normal school. Most women in your position would have married the first man who asked, just for security. Most men who asked wanted a servant, not a wife, Eleanor replied. I preferred independence to servitude. And now? Luke asked. Do you still see marriage as servitude? Eleanor considered this. A week ago, she would have said yes without hesitation. But now, after days of genuine conversation and growing companionship, she wasn't so sure. I'm beginning to think it depends on the marriage, she said carefully. And the man. Luke set down his book. Eleanor, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. All right. Are you agreeing to this courtship because you want to, or because you feel you have no other choice? Eleanor met his gaze directly. Both, she said. I won't lie and say I would be here if I had other options. I'm not in a position to refuse security when it's offered. But Luke, I wouldn't have stayed this long if I didn't believe there was something genuine here. If I thought you were the kind of man who would use my desperation against me, I would have left by now, even if it meant walking to Denver with nothing but the dress on my back. And if your circumstances changed, Luke pressed, if somehow your reputation was restored and you could return to teaching in Copper Ridge, would you stay? Eleanor hesitated. A week ago, the answer would have been an immediate no. But now, sitting in this comfortable room with this complicated man, she found herself uncertain. I don't know, she admitted. Ask me again in another week. Luke smiled. Fair enough. The school was taking shape with remarkable speed. Luke had assigned a crew of men to build it, and they worked with the efficiency of men who knew their employer expected excellence. Eleanor visited the site daily, marveling at how her vague descriptions of an ideal schoolroom had been transformed into solid reality. There would be large windows for light, a pot-bellied stove for winter warmth, slate boards on the walls, and proper desks instead of rough benches. The attached living quarters, which Luke insisted on despite Eleanor's protests, included a bedroom, a small sitting room, and a kitchen. You might want your own space sometimes, Luke said when she questioned the expense, or you might not, but I want you to have the choice. Choice. It was a word Luke used often, and Eleanor was beginning to understand that he meant it. He was giving her choices at every turn. Where to place the school, how to furnish it, whether to live in the main house or independently. He never assumed, never commanded, never took for granted that she would defer to his judgment simply because he was male and wealthy and she was neither. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. On Sunday, Luke suggested they attend church in Copper Ridge together. Eleanor's immediate instinct was to refuse. The thought of facing the town again made her physically ill, but Luke was insistent. The longer you stay away, the more power their gossip has, he said. We need to show them that you're not hiding in shame, that we're together officially courting, and that anyone who questions it will answer to me. So Eleanor put on her best dress, one of Margaret's that Rosa had altered to fit perfectly, and climbed into Luke's carriage beside him. Mrs. Ortega had insisted on coming too, as both chaperone and support, and her solid presence in the back seat was oddly comforting. The church was packed, as it always was on Sunday mornings. When Luke's carriage pulled up in front, a ripple of whispers spread through the people gathered outside. Eleanor saw Prudence Whitmore's eyes widen in shock. She saw the sheriff touch his hat awkwardly. She saw several of her former students' faces light up with joy. Luke helped her down from the carriage with courtly grace, then offered his arm. Head high, he murmured. You've done nothing wrong. They walked up the church steps together, and the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Inside, heads turned as they made their way down the aisle. Luke led her to a pew near the front, the Calhoun family pew, Eleanor realized, one of the most prominent in the church, and sat beside her, his presence radiating proprietorial protection. The minister, Reverend Phillips, nearly fumbled his Bible when he saw them, but to his credit, he recovered quickly and launched into his sermon without comment. Eleanor barely heard a word of it. She was too conscious of the eyes boring into her back, the whispers that even the sanctity of church couldn't fully suppress. After the service, Luke made no attempt to hurry away. Instead, he stood in the churchyard, Eleanor on his arm, and received the congregation like a lord greeting his vassal. Most people offered awkward congratulations on their engagement. Some couldn't quite meet Eleanor's eyes. A few brave souls, including Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, and the families who had signed the letter supporting Eleanor, made a point of warmly welcoming her back. Martha Kane did not attend church that day. Neither did Timothy. But Prudence Whitmore approached, her face a mask of false sweetness. "Why, Miss Graves, how lovely to see you again," she cooed. "And Mr. Calhoun, you must be so pleased to have found a suitable companion." The pause before suitable was calculated to wound. Eleanor felt Luke tense beside her, but before he could speak, she found her own voice. "Mrs. Whitmore," Eleanor said coolly, "how kind of you to offer your opinion on Mr. Calhoun's personal choices. I'm sure he values your input almost as much as he values your discretion." Prudence flushed. Several people nearby turned to watch the exchange, smelling blood in the water. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Prudence said stiffly. "Don't you?" Eleanor's voice remained pleasant, but steel underneath. "How strange. I was under the impression that you were quite free with your opinions on matters that don't concern you. Perhaps I was mistaken." Luke made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Prudence's flush deepened to an ugly red, and she turned on her heel and stalked away. Several people applauded softly, and Eleanor felt a fierce surge of satisfaction. On the ride back to the ranch, Luke turned to her with undisguised admiration. "That was magnificently done." "I shouldn't have been so sharp," Eleanor said, though without much regret. "It wasn't Christian." "It was necessary," Luke countered. "People like Prudence Whitmore need to know there are consequences for cruelty. You showed her that you're not a victim they can torment with impunity. That was important." Mrs. Ortega leaned forward from the back seat. "You sounded like a true lady of the house," she said approvingly, "like someone who belongs at Mr. Luke's side." Eleanor felt something warm gloom in her chest. Belonging. It was something she had never quite achieved in Copper Ridge, despite 3 years of trying. She had always been the outsider, the Eastern school teacher who didn't quite fit. But at Luke's side, with his implicit backing and explicit protection, she had found a kind of belonging she hadn't known she was missing. That evening, after dinner, Luke asked her to walk with him. They strolled through the ranch yard as the sun set, painting the mountains gold and crimson. The air was cooling rapidly, carrying the promise of autumn. "I've been thinking about timing," Luke said as they walked. "The school will be finished in another week. Hartwell will have the legal documents ready around the same time. If you're willing, I'd like to announce our formal engagement then. A party here at the ranch for all our neighbors and employees. A chance to make it official and public." Eleanor's heart raced. "That's very soon." "It is," Luke agreed. "But I think waiting longer just gives gossip more time to fester. Better to claim our story and move forward." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Eleanor, I need to know. Are you staying because you want this, or because you feel trapped?" She looked up at him, this man who had appeared out of nowhere to save her from destruction, who had offered her everything she needed and asked for only partnership in return. In the fading light, his face was all strong planes and shadows, his blue eyes intense as they searched hers. "I'm staying because I choose to," Eleanor said slowly, testing the truth of the words as she spoke them. "A week ago, I would have said I had no choice, but I do have choices, Luke. I could have refused your offer and taken my chances elsewhere. I could have accepted your protection but refused courtship. I could have gone through the motions without engaging genuinely." She took a breath. "But I haven't done any of those things. I'm here because I want to be, because I think we might actually be able to build something real together." Luke's expression softened. "Then yes, you'll marry me?" Eleanor felt a flutter of panic and excitement warring in her chest. This was it, the moment where she committed to this strange, improbable future, where she stopped being Eleanor Graves, solitary schoolteacher, and became Eleanor Calhoun, rancher's wife. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Luke's smile was like sunrise. He reached out and cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "Thank you," he said simply. "I promise you won't regret it." Then he leaned down and kissed her, soft and careful, asking rather than demanding. Eleanor's first kiss, and it was chaste and sweet and filled with promise. When he pulled back, her heart was hammering and her face was flushed. "We should probably make this official," Luke said, his voice slightly rough, "with a ring and a proper proposal on my knee and all the traditional nonsense." "I don't need traditional nonsense," Eleanor said, finding her voice. "I just need honesty and partnership and books," Luke finished, grinning. "You need books? I've noticed how you eye my library like a prospector eyes gold."
the sound bubbling up from some deep well of relief and joy. "I do like your book." "Then they're yours," Luke said simply.
"Everything I have is yours, if you'll have me." Standing there in the gathering darkness, with the ranch settling into evening quiet around them, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. The terror that had gripped her since Martha Kane's accusations was loosening its hold. In its place was something new, fragile, but real. Hope. Not just hope for security or respectability, but hope for something she had never let herself imagine. A true partnership, a real marriage, maybe even love. "I'll have you," she said softly. "God help us both. I'll have you." The engagement party took place on a Saturday evening 3 weeks later, and the Triple C Ranch was transformed. Lanterns hung from every post and beam, casting warm pools of light across the yard. Long tables groaned under the weight of food that Mrs. Ortega and her helpers had been preparing for days. Roasted beef, fresh bread, pies made from the last of summer's berries, vegetables from the ranch garden. A makeshift dance floor had been constructed near the barn, and a small band of musicians Luke had brought from Denver tuned their instruments as guests began to arrive. Eleanor stood in her room, staring at her reflection in the mirror, and tried to control her trembling hands. The dress she wore was new, the first thing she had owned in months that hadn't belonged to Margaret Calhoun. Luke had insisted on taking her to Denver the week before, to a dressmaker who had fitted her for a gown in deep green silk that brought out the color of her eyes. It was the most beautiful thing Eleanor had ever worn, with delicate lace at the throat and sleeves that made her feel like someone from a different life entirely. "You look like a princess from a storybook," Rosa said, adjusting the final pin in Eleanor's hair. The girl had spent an hour arranging it into an elaborate style that was both elegant and secure. "Mr. Luke won't be able to take his eyes off you." Eleanor touched the cameo brooch at her throat. Another gift from Luke, though this one had come with a story. It had belonged to his mother, he'd told her, one of the few things he'd salvaged from the Texas house after his father died. Giving it to Eleanor meant something, though neither of them had put that meaning into words. A knock at the door announced Mrs. Ortega. "The guests are arriving," she said, her eyes suspiciously bright as she took in Eleanor's appearance. "And Mr. Luke is wearing a hole in the parlor carpet waiting for you." Eleanor descended the stairs with her heart in her throat. The house was filled with people. Ranch hands in their best clothes, neighboring ranchers and their families, merchants from Copper Ridge, even Sheriff Bradley looking uncomfortable in a suit. But Eleanor's eyes went immediately to Luke, standing near the fireplace in a black suit that made him look both dangerous and devastatingly handsome. When he saw her, his expression shifted into something that made her breath catch. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture that was both old-fashioned and oddly intimate. "You're beautiful," he said quietly, for her ears only. "I knew you would be." "You clean up rather well yourself," Eleanor managed, and was rewarded with that small smile she had come to cherish. Luke kept her hand tucked into the crook of his arm as they greeted guests. Most offered genuine congratulations, though Eleanor could see calculation in some eyes. People trying to understand how a disgraced schoolteacher had managed to capture the territory's most eligible bachelor. Let them wonder, she thought with a flash of defiance. Let them try to puzzle out a story that didn't fit their narrow expectations. The Hendersons arrived with their 3 children, and young Timmy broke away from his parents to throw his arms around Eleanor's waist. "Miss Graves, Mrs. Calhoun, are you coming back to teach us?" "Not Mrs. Calhoun yet," Eleanor said, ruffling his hair. "But yes, Timmy, I'll be teaching again. Mr. Calhoun is building a school right here on the ranch. Can I come, even though we don't live here?" The boy's eyes were huge with hope. Luke crouched down to Timmy's level. "Any child who wants to learn is welcome at our school," he said seriously. "Your parents will just have to arrange transportation. Think you can manage the ride?" Timmy nodded vigorously, and his parents smiled their gratitude. It was a small moment, but Eleanor felt its significance. Luke wasn't just building her a school, he was building a community, creating something that would outlast both of them. The evening progressed with food and music and laughter. Luke introduced Eleanor to neighboring ranchers she hadn't met, men who controlled vast tracts of land and whose respect meant something in this territory. To her surprise, they treated her with courtesy, even deference. It took her a while to understand why. She was under Luke Calhoun's protection, and insulting her meant insulting him. It was a heady feeling, this borrowed power, though Eleanor wasn't entirely comfortable with it. As the sun set and the lanterns glowed brighter, Luke led her to the dance floor for the first waltz. Eleanor had learned to dance as a girl in Philadelphia, but it had been years, and she was nervous about embarrassing herself. But Luke was a confident lead, and soon she found herself relaxing into the rhythm, letting him guide her across the floor. "You're doing wonderfully," he murmured as they turned. "Everyone is watching you and thinking how lucky I am." "Are you?" Eleanor asked. "Lucky?" "Luckier than I deserve," Luke said, and the sincerity in his voice made her throat tight. They danced 3 waltzes before Luke reluctantly surrendered her to his foreman, a grizzled man named Hank, who danced with surprising grace and regaled Eleanor with stories of Luke's early days building the ranch. "He was half wild back then," Hank said with affection. "All ambition and determination and no sense of when to quit. Worked himself near to death that first winter, but he built something worth having, and now he's finally got someone to share it with. About damn time, if you ask me." As the evening wore on and Eleanor danced with various ranch hands and neighbors, she found herself watching Luke across the crowded yard. He was talking with a group of ranchers, his expression serious as they discussed something, probably business, knowing Luke. But even absorbed in conversation, his eyes kept finding her, checking that she was all right, making sure she wasn't overwhelmed. It was possessive, that constant attention, but not in a way that felt suffocating, more like being held in someone's regard, valued and protected. Eleanor was still learning to accept it, this feeling of mattering to someone. The only shadow on the evening came when Prudence Whitmore arrived, late and without her husband. She had clearly been drinking, not enough to be obviously drunk, but enough to loosen her tongue and sharpen her spite. Eleanor was talking with Mrs. Henderson when Prudence materialized beside them. "How nice for you, Eleanor," Prudence said, her smile sharp as glass. "Landing on your feet after such an unfortunate scandal. Some women have all the luck." Mrs. Henderson's expression froze. Eleanor felt tension boil in her shoulders, but she kept her voice level. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitmore. How kind of you to attend." "Oh, I wouldn't miss it," Prudence continued, swaying slightly. "It's not every day we see such a strategic marriage. Tell me, dear, was it difficult to convince Mr. Calhoun that you were worth rescuing, or did you use other means of persuasion?" The insult was unmistakable. Mrs. Henderson gasped. Several people nearby turned to stare. Eleanor felt heat flood her face, but before she could respond, Luke appeared at her side, his expression thunderous. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I think you've had too much to drink. Let me arrange a carriage to take you home." "I'm perfectly fine," Prudence snapped. "I was just having a conversation with your intended. Surely that's allowed at an engagement party." "Conversations are allowed," Luke said. "Insults are not. You have 2 choices, Mrs. Whitmore. You can apologize to Eleanor right now, sincerely and publicly, or you can leave my property and never return. Choose quickly." The yard had gone silent. Everyone was watching now, waiting to see what Prudence would do. Eleanor saw the calculation in the woman's eyes, the weighing of pride against social consequence. To be banned from the Triple C meant being cut off from one of the territory's most important social centers. It meant her husband's business would suffer. Her own standing would plummet. Prudence's face twisted with fury and humiliation. "I apologize," she bit out, the words sounding like they were being torn from her throat. "I spoke in poor taste. Forgive me." "Accepted," Eleanor said, though the word felt like ash in her mouth. She didn't want this forced apology, this public humiliation of a woman who was already bitter and defeated. But she understood that Luke was making a point, establishing boundaries that would protect her long after this party ended. Prudence fled shortly after, and the party resumed, though with an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. When the last guest finally departed near midnight, Eleanor found herself alone with Luke on the porch, both of them exhausted but unable to quite let go of the evening's events. "I'm sorry," Luke said, staring out at the dark mountains. "I didn't mean to make a scene, but I won't tolerate anyone speaking to you that way." "I know," Eleanor said, "and part of me is grateful. But Luke,
I don't want to be someone who needs constant defending. I don't want to be fragile. Luke turned to look at her. You're the least fragile person I know.
You faced down a mob, rebuilt your life from nothing, and agreed to marry a man you barely knew because you saw possibility where others would have seen only fear. That's not fragility, that's steel wrapped in silk. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. But everyone needs defending sometime, even the strong ones. Especially the strong ones because they're so used to standing alone. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. I'm not used to this, she whispered, having someone in my corner. It scares me. I know, Luke said. It scares me too. I've been alone a long time, Eleanor. Building walls, keeping people at a distance. You're asking me to tear those walls down, and I don't know if I remember how. He took her hands in his. But I want to try. With you, I want to try. They stood there in the darkness, hands clasped, both of them trembling on the edge of something vast and terrifying and wonderful. Then Luke drew her closer and kissed her, deeper this time than that first chaste kiss. And Eleanor felt something inside her unfurl like a flower towards sun. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. We should probably wait until we're married, Luke said, his voice rough. Probably, Eleanor agreed, though she didn't step back. I'm trying to be honorable here. I know, it's very frustrating. Luke laughed, a sound of pure delight. Come on, I'll walk you upstairs before I lose what's left of my good intentions. The wedding was set for 4 weeks later, just enough time for Eleanor to feel both prepared and terrified. The intervening weeks passed in a blur of preparation. The school was completed and Eleanor began organizing it, selecting books and supplies with Luke's generous budget. Several ranch families enrolled their children, and to Eleanor's surprise, 3 families from Copper Ridge also asked if their children could attend. Word is spread that you're an exceptional teacher, Luke told her, and that my school will be the best equipped in the territory. People want their children to have opportunities. Eleanor threw herself into preparing the schoolroom, grateful for work that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. Because at night, alone in her room, anxiety would creep in. She was about to marry a man she had known for less than 2 months. She was about to commit her entire future to this partnership that still felt half real, like something that might dissolve if examined too closely. And then there was the physical reality of marriage, which Eleanor barely understood. Mrs. Ortega had offered awkward explanations, Rosa had giggled and provided scandalous details, but Eleanor still felt desperately unprepared for the intimacy that marriage would bring. She and Luke hadn't discussed it beyond that kiss on the porch, both of them apparently too awkward to address the subject directly. One evening, a week before the wedding, Eleanor finally worked up the courage to broach the topic. They were in the study, Luke working on accounts while Eleanor read, when she set down her book with more force than necessary. We need to talk, she said abruptly. Luke looked up, instantly alert. All right. Eleanor felt her face heat but forced herself to continue. About the wedding night. About marital relations. We haven't discussed expectations, and I think we should. Luke set down his pen, his expression carefully neutral. What would you like to know? I don't know what I don't know, Eleanor said, frustrated. I've had explanations from Mrs. Ortega and Rosa, but they contradict each other. One makes it sound like a beautiful expression of love, the other makes it sound like an uncomfortable duty. I don't know what to expect, and I don't know what you expect, and I think we should probably figure that out before we're actually married. Luke was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Come here. Eleanor crossed to his desk, her heart pounding. Luke took her hand and drew her around to sit on the edge of the desk facing him. I expect, he said carefully, that our wedding night will be awkward and probably not particularly graceful, because these things usually are the first time. I expect that we'll both be nervous and uncertain. I expect that it will take time for us to learn what pleases each other, what feels good and what doesn't. He met her eyes directly. What I don't expect is for you to simply endure something unpleasant out of duty. That's not what I want from you, Eleanor. I want a partner in all things, including that. And partnership means communication, patience, and mutual pleasure. Eleanor felt some of her anxiety ease. Mrs. Ortega made it sound like men just take what they want, and women have to accept it. Some men do, Luke said, his voice hardening. and those men are selfish fools. Eleanor, I've been married before. I know that intimacy can be good for both people, or it can be miserable for one or both. Which it is depends entirely on whether both people are willing to be honest about what they need and want. He squeezed her hand. I promise you this. I will never force anything. I will never make you do something you're uncomfortable with. And if something doesn't feel right, you tell me and we stop. No questions, no guilt. Understood? Eleanor felt tears of relief sting her eyes. Understood. Good. Luke pulled her closer, so she was standing between his knees. Now, let me tell you what I hope for our wedding night, and you tell me if any of it sounds objectionable. What followed was the most intimate, honest conversation Eleanor had ever had with anyone. Luke spoke plainly but not crudely, explaining what would happen, what he hoped might happen, always checking to make sure she understood and was comfortable. By the end, Eleanor's face was burning, but her anxiety had been replaced with something else. Anticipation, curiosity, even a tentative excitement. Better? Luke asked when they had finished talking. Much better, Eleanor said. Thank you for being honest with me. Always, Luke promised. In all things, Eleanor. That's the foundation we're building on. Honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. The wedding took place on a brilliant October afternoon, with the aspen trees turning gold on the mountainsides, and the air crisp with approaching autumn. They married in the small church in Copper Ridge, because Luke insisted on making their union as public and legitimate as possible. The church was packed, ranch hands and neighbors, business associates from Denver, even a few of Eleanor's former students with their families. Martha Kane did not attend. According to gossip that reached the Triple C, she had quietly left Copper Ridge 2 weeks earlier, moving to live with relatives in Kansas. Her nephew Timothy had gone with her. The legal case Luke had prepared never went to trial. Martha's lawyer had negotiated a settlement that included a public retraction of her accusations and a written apology to Eleanor. It wasn't enough, would never be enough to fully compensate for the damage she had done, but it was something. Eleanor walked down the aisle alone, having no father or family to give her away. But she didn't feel alone. She felt every eye in the church on her, most of them friendly now, supporting this union that had started in scandal and transformed into something the town could approve. And at the end of the aisle stood Luke, tall and solid in his black suit, his eyes never leaving her face as she approached. Reverend Phillips performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity, though Eleanor barely heard the words. She was too focused on Luke's hands holding hers, warm and steady, on his voice as he spoke his vows, low and certain. On the moment when he slipped a gold band onto her finger, the metal still warm from his pocket. When Reverend Phillips finally pronounced them man and wife, Luke kissed her with a gentleness that somehow promised fiercer things to come. The congregation applauded, and Eleanor turned to face them as Mrs. Eleanor Calhoun, no longer a disgraced schoolteacher but a rancher's wife, a woman of standing and respect. The reception was held back at the Triple C, even more elaborate than the engagement party. There was more food, more music, more laughter. Eleanor danced with Luke, with Hank, with Sheriff Bradley, who apologized gruffly for not believing in her innocence from the start. She danced with her former students and their fathers, with neighboring ranchers who now treated her as one of their own. As the sun set and the party showed no signs of winding down, Luke leaned close to Eleanor and murmured, "Should we slip away? I don't think anyone will notice." Eleanor's stomach fluttered with nerves and anticipation. "I think we should." They made their escape quietly, walking hand in hand back to the main house while the party continued in the yard. Mrs. Ortega had prepared the master bedroom, Luke's room, though Eleanor supposed it was now theirs. Candles flickered on every surface, casting warm, dancing shadows. Someone had scattered rose petals on the bed, and a fire crackled in the hearth despite the mild evening. "Mrs. Ortega is a romantic," Luke said wryly. "I hope it's not too much." "It's perfect," Eleanor whispered. They stood there awkwardly for a moment, suddenly unsure despite all their honest conversations. Then Luke said, "I need to tell you something." Eleanor's heart clenched with sudden fear. "What?" "I'm terrified," Luke admitted. "I know we talked about this. I know we have an understanding. But Eleanor, I want this to be good for you. I want you to be happy. And I'm terrified I'll somehow ruin this. ruin us. Eleanor felt her fear drain away, replaced by tenderness for this strong man who was brave enough to admit his weakness. She stepped closer and placed her hands on his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath the fabric of his shirt. "Then we'll be terrified together," she said, echoing his words from weeks earlier, "and we'll figure it out together. That's what partners do." Luke cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, and this time there was no holding back. This time the kiss deepened into something hungry and demanding, and Eleanor responded with an eagerness that surprised them both. Luke's hands moved to the buttons of her dress, fumbling slightly, and Eleanor laughed against his mouth. "Let me," she said, stepping back to unfasten the seemingly endless row of buttons. Her fingers trembled, but she managed, and the dress pooled at her feet. Luke's eyes went dark as he took in the sight of her in her chemise and petticoats, and for a moment Eleanor felt self-conscious. But then he said, "You're so beautiful, it hurts to look at you," and self-consciousness vanished in a wave of desire. What followed was exactly as Luke had predicted, awkward and uncertain at first, both of them too nervous to fully relax. But they talked through it, laughing at clumsy moments, adjusting when something didn't feel right. And gradually, awkwardness gave way to something else, to pleasure and connection, and an intimacy that was both physical and emotional. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the candlelight, both breathing hard, both changed in ways that had nothing to do with physical consummation and everything to do with trust and vulnerability and the willingness to be seen completely by another person. "Are you all right?" Luke asked, his voice rough. "More than all right," Eleanor whispered. She was sore and exhausted and happier than she could remember being in years. That was worth the wait, Luke supplied, smiling. "Worth everything," Eleanor corrected. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, while outside the party continued and the stars wheeled overhead and the ranch settled into night. And if Eleanor dreamed of the future, of children playing in the yard, of students bent over their lessons, of long years stretching ahead filled with work and love and partnership, those dreams felt less like fantasy now and more like promise. In the morning, they woke to find sunlight streaming through the window, and Mrs. Ortega discreetly leaving a breakfast tray outside their door. They ate in bed, feeding each other bites of toast and laughing at nothing in particular, delirious with new marriage and new beginning. "I should probably check on the ranch," Luke said eventually, though he made no move to leave the bed. "And I should probably start organizing the school's curriculum," Eleanor said, equally unmotivated. They looked at each other and burst out laughing. "How long before people expect us to emerge?" Eleanor asked. "At least a week," Luke said solemnly. "It's traditional." "A week might be excessive." "You're probably right." Luke pulled her closer. "How about 3 days?" "Compromise at 4, Eleanor negotiated, and sealed the bargain with a kiss. The days that followed their wedding established the rhythm that would define their marriage. Luke rose early to work the ranch, but Eleanor often rose with him, brewing coffee in the kitchen while he planned the day with Hank. She opened her school and found joy in teaching again, this time without the constant worry of town politics and gossip. Her students were a mixed group, ranch children, town children, even a few older teenagers who had never learned to read and were determined to remedy that. Luke often stopped by during the day, ostensibly to check on the building, but really to see Eleanor. She would look up from helping a student and find him watching from the doorway, his expression soft with something that might have been love, though neither of them had spoken that word yet. In the evenings, they ate dinner together and talked about their days. Eleanor told him about her students' progress, and Luke shared the challenges of managing a ranch empire. They read together, played chess, argued good-naturedly about politics and philosophy. And at night, they learned each other in the privacy of their bedroom, the initial awkwardness giving way to passion and tenderness, and a physical connection that surprised them both with its intensity. It was on one of those quiet evenings, about 3 months after their wedding, that Eleanor realized something had changed in her body. She had been feeling tired lately, queasy in the mornings, and her monthly courses were late. At first, she had attributed it to the stress of her new life, but as the signs continued, a different possibility emerged. She said nothing to Luke that evening, wanting to be certain before she raised hopes that might prove false. But the next morning, when Mrs. Ortega found her being sick in the kitchen, the older woman took one look at her and smiled.
How long? Mrs. Ortega asked gently. I don't know for certain, Eleanor said, wiping her mouth with a shaking hand. Maybe 6 weeks? I've been too busy to pay attention. Busy making a baby, Mrs. Ortega said with satisfaction. I wondered when this would happen. You two can barely keep your hands off each other. Eleanor felt her face heat. Mrs. Ortega.
It's natural, the housekeeper said, waving away her embarrassment. And wonderful news, Mr. Luke will be over the moon. But Eleanor waited to tell him, wanting to see the doctor first. Luke noticed something was different. She caught him watching her with puzzled concern. But he didn't press, respecting her privacy until she was ready to share. Dr. Morrison confirmed what Eleanor already suspected. She was about 8 weeks pregnant, healthy, and should expect to deliver in late spring. Eleanor walked out of his office in a daze, her hand pressed to her still flat stomach, marveling at the life growing inside her. She told Luke that evening after dinner, unable to wait any longer. They were in the study, their usual spot, when she set down her book and said, I have something to tell you. Luke looked up from his ledgers, instantly alert. What is it? Eleanor took a breath. I saw Dr. Morrison today. Luke's face went pale. Are you ill? Eleanor, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Eleanor said quickly, then smiled. Everything's right. Luke, I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby. For a long moment, Luke just stared at her. Then he was across the room, pulling her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. A baby, he whispered. Eleanor, a baby. Are you happy? She asked, suddenly uncertain. I know we haven't been married long, and happy. Luke laughed, a sound caught between joy and disbelief. I'm terrified and elated and grateful, and so many things I don't have words for. Eleanor, you've given me everything. A home, a partner, and now a child. How could I be anything but happy? He placed his hand on her stomach, reverent and gentle. When? Late May, Dr. Morrison thinks. Maybe early June. Right when the calves are being born, Luke said, then laughed at the absurdity of comparing their child to livestock. I'm going to be a father. You're going to be a wonderful father, Eleanor corrected. She covered his hand with hers. We're going to be a family. They stood there together, hands joined over the small life they had created, and Eleanor felt something settle into place in her chest. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it. Not just security or respectability, but belonging. Home, family, love, though they still hadn't spoken the word aloud. The winter passed in a cocoon of domesticity and anticipation. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though the morning sickness that had announced the baby's existence lingered stubbornly through the first 3 months. Luke became absurdly protective, insisting she rest more, worry less, and stop climbing ladders to reach books on high shelves in the schoolroom. I'm pregnant, not invalid, Eleanor protested one afternoon when Luke physically lifted her down from a step stool she'd been using to arrange supplies. I'm aware, Luke said, not releasing her until her feet were firmly on the ground. But I'd prefer my wife and child both survive this experience intact, which means no unnecessary risk. You're impossible, Eleanor said, but she was smiling as she said it. His overprotectiveness was endearing, even when it was frustrating. The school flourished despite Eleanor's condition. By January, she had 23 students ranging from 5 years old to 17, and she'd had to hire an assistant, a young woman named Sarah Thompson from Denver, who had teaching credentials and a gentle way with the younger children. The name Sarah had given Luke pause when Eleanor first mentioned hiring her, but he'd simply nodded and said, My sister would have liked knowing her name was helping someone build a future. As Eleanor's belly swelled with the growing baby, something else grew too, the unspoken thing between her and Luke that had been there since that first kiss, but neither had quite acknowledged. They were deeply happy together. That much was obvious to anyone who saw them. They laughed constantly, touched constantly, moved through their days in the synchronized rhythm of people who had learned to read each other's needs and moods. But the word love remained unspoken, hovering between them like something precious and fragile that neither dared quite touch. It was Mrs. Ortega who finally addressed the elephant in the room. Eleanor was sitting in the kitchen one March afternoon, peeling apples for a pie while the housekeeper kneaded bread dough with practiced efficiency. They worked in comfortable silence until Mrs. Ortega said abruptly, "You love him." Eleanor's knife slipped, nearly catching her thumb. "What?" "Mr. Luke, you love him. Anyone with eyes can see it, so why don't you tell him?" Eleanor stared at the apple in her hand. "I don't know if he feels the same way. We married for practical reasons, remember? Partnership, not romance." Mrs. Ortega snorted. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon and stars. He comes home early from work just to see you. He talks about you constantly. Eleanor said this. Eleanor thinks that. Eleanor is the smartest person I know. If that's not love, I don't know what is." "But he hasn't said it," Eleanor protested. "And I'm afraid if I say it first, I'll be admitting that I need him more than he needs me. That I've become dependent in exactly the way I swore I wouldn't." Mrs. Ortega stopped kneading and fixed Eleanor with a stern look. "Love isn't weakness, mija, and needing someone isn't the same as being helpless. You're still Eleanor, strong, capable, independent Eleanor. You just also happen to love your husband. Those things can both be true at the same time." Eleanor set down her knife, her hand moving unconsciously to her swollen belly where the baby was doing somersaults. "What if I say it and he doesn't say it back?" "Then you'll know where you stand," Mrs. Ortega said practically. "But I don't think that's going to happen. I think he's just as scared as you are, just as worried about admitting how much he needs you. Someone has to be brave first." That evening, Eleanor watched Luke across the dinner table, the way lamplight caught the silver in his hair, the way his hands moved as he gestured while telling a story about one of his ranch hands, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at something she said. And she thought about all the ways he had shown her love without speaking the word. The school he had built, the legal protections he had insisted on, the way he brought her wildflowers for no reason, the way he held her at night with such tenderness it made her throat ache, the way he read to their unborn child, his deep voice rumbling through her belly as he recited poetry and adventure stories to a baby who couldn't possibly understand but seemed to quiet and listen anyway. After dinner, they settled into their usual routine. Eleanor in her chair with sewing for the baby, Luke at his desk with paperwork. The study was warm with firelight, peaceful in the way only shared silence between comfortable people can be. Eleanor had been making baby clothes for weeks now, tiny gowns and caps that seemed impossibly small, and she was just finishing a delicate hem when she set down her needle and spoke. "Luke, I need to tell you something." He looked up immediately, always attuned to shifts in her tone. "What is it? Is it the baby? Are you feeling all right?" "The baby's fine. I'm fine. I just..." Eleanor took a breath. "I need to tell you that I love you." The words hung in the air between them. Luke went completely still, his pen frozen over his lip. For a terrible moment, Eleanor thought she had made a catastrophic mistake, that she had exposed herself for nothing, that he would say something kind and careful that would break her heart. Then Luke stood, crossed to her chair and knelt beside it, taking her hands in his. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Say it again," he whispered. "I love you," Eleanor said, stronger this time. "I don't know when it happened, maybe gradually, maybe all at once. But I love you, Calhoun. Not for saving me, not for the security you provide, not even for this child we're bringing into the world. I love you for who you are, for your kindness and your strength and your terrible overprotectiveness, for the way you read to our baby and bring me flowers and listen when I talk about my students, for the way you made me feel safe enough to trust again. I love you." Luke pressed his forehead against their joined hands. "I've loved you since the day I saw you standing in that street, refusing to bow to that mob. I've loved you through every day since, more and more each time you laugh or argue with me or show me what real partnership looks like. I didn't tell you because I was afraid you'd think I was demanding something you couldn't give, afraid I was breaking the terms of our agreement." "There are no terms anymore," Eleanor said, cupping his face with her free hand. "There's just us. Just this. Just love, Luke. We're allowed to have that." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, tasting of joy and relief and promises finally spoken. When they broke apart, both were crying, tears of happiness mingling as Luke placed his hand on Eleanor's belly and their child kicked against his palm as if in celebration. "I love you,"
Luke said again, as if he couldn't quite believe he was allowed to say the word. I love you, and I love this baby, and I love the life we're building together. Eleanor, you gave me more than I ever dared to hope for. We gave each other everything, Eleanor corrected. That's what partnership means. Spring arrived with an explosion of wildflowers and new calves, and Eleanor's pregnancy reached its final week. She had to stop teaching in late April, her belly too large and her energy too depleted to manage a classroom full of energetic children. Sarah Thompson took over full teaching duties while Eleanor supervised from home, writing lesson plans and grading papers from the comfort of the parlor sofa, where Luke insisted she spend most of her time. I'm not an invalid, Eleanor repeated for what felt like the 1000th time, but her protests lacked heat. The truth was, she was exhausted. Her back ached constantly, and she could barely walk 10 steps without needing to sit down. The baby had grown enormous, sitting so low in her belly that Dr. Morrison predicted an early arrival. He was right. On May 17th, 3 weeks before her due date, Eleanor woke in the early morning hours with a sharp pain low in her belly. She lay still for a moment, waiting to see if it would repeat. When it did, unmistakable and intensifying, she reached over and shook Luke's shoulder. It's time, she said simply. Luke was awake instantly, all trace of sleep vanishing. Are you sure? How do you feel? Should I get the doctor? Yes. Terrified. And yes, Eleanor said. And then another pain hit, and she grabbed Luke's hand hard enough to make him wince. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of pain and effort and moments of stark terror. Mrs. Ortega took charge with the calm efficiency of a woman who had attended dozens of births, boiling water, and preparing clean linens while Rosa ran to fetch Dr. Morrison. Luke refused to leave Eleanor's side, despite the doctor's suggestion that he wait downstairs as most husbands did. I'm not most husbands, Luke said flatly, holding Eleanor's hand while she screamed through another contraction. I'm staying. Eleanor was grateful for his presence, even as she cursed him thoroughly for putting her in this condition. Labor was agony, worse than anything she could have imagined, and there were moments when she was certain she wouldn't survive it. But Dr. Morrison remained calm and encouraging. Miss Ortega wiped her face with cool cloths, and Luke stayed beside her, murmuring words of love and encouragement even as she broke his fingers with her grip. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith and poured golden light through the bedroom window, Eleanor gave one final tremendous push, and the baby slipped free into Dr. Morrison's waiting hands. For a terrible moment there was silence, and Eleanor's heart stopped. Then a thin, angry wail filled the room, and Eleanor collapsed back against the pillows, sobbing with relief. A girl, Dr. Morrison announced, cleaning the baby with practiced efficiency. Small but healthy, with excellent lungs. He placed the tiny, squalling infant on Eleanor's chest, and Eleanor stared down at her daughter with wonder. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, covered in vernix, her little fists waving furiously at this cold, bright new world. She had a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be blue like her father's once the newborn haze cleared. Hello, Eleanor whispered, touching one impossibly tiny hand. Hello, little one. We've been waiting for you. Beside her, Luke made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. His hand joined Eleanor's, both of them touching their daughter with reverent gentleness. She's perfect, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She's absolutely perfect. Will you name her? Mrs. Ortega asked, peering over Eleanor's shoulder at the baby with undisguised delight. Eleanor and Luke had discussed names for months, unable to decide between several options. But now, looking at her daughter's fierce little face, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty. She looked at Luke and saw the same knowledge reflected in his eye. Sarah, Eleanor said. Sarah Margaret Calhoun, for your sister and your first wife, for the women who came before and made this possible. Luke's eyes flooded with tears. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to Eleanor's forehead, then to the baby's downy head. Sarah Margaret, he repeated. Welcome to the world, little one. You're so loved already. The weeks after Sarah's birth were a chaos of sleepless nights and endless feedings and the steep learning curve of new parenthood. Eleanor had thought teaching 20 children would prepare her for one infant, but she quickly learned that babies operated on their own incomprehensible logic.
Sarah seemed to need feeding constantly, cried at odd hours, and could only be soothed by being walked around the room in a particular way that made Eleanor's still recovering body ache. But Luke threw himself into fatherhood with the same determination he brought to everything. He walked Sarah at 3 a.m. when Eleanor was too exhausted to move. He changed nappies without complaint, learned to swaddle her in the tight bundles she preferred, and sang her lullabies in his deep, rumbling voice that somehow always calmed her when nothing else would. Watching him with their daughter, Eleanor fell in love with him all over again. By July, they had found their rhythm. Sarah was sleeping in longer stretches. Eleanor had mostly recovered from the birth, and life had settled into a new normal. Eleanor returned to teaching part-time with Sarah in a cradle beside her desk, and found that her students were delighted to have a baby in the classroom. The older girls especially loved helping care for her, and Sarah seemed to enjoy the constant attention and stimulation. It was on a warm August evening, with Sarah sleeping peacefully in her cradle and Eleanor and Luke sitting on the porch watching the sunset, that Eleanor realized how completely her life had transformed. A year ago, she had been a pariah, her reputation destroyed, her future terrifying in its uncertainty. Now she was a wife, a mother, a teacher again, and a woman who was genuinely happy. "What are you thinking?" Luke asked, noticing her silence. "I'm thinking about how Martha Kane's lie ended up being the best thing that ever happened to me," Eleanor said. "How something intended to destroy me actually built everything I have now." Luke reached over and took her hand. "Martha Kane's lie didn't build anything. We did. You and me choosing each other every day, even when it was hard. That's what built this." "You're right," Eleanor said. "But I've been thinking maybe I should thank her." Luke laughed. "You want to thank the woman who tried to ruin your life?" "I want to forgive her," Eleanor clarified. "I want to let go of the anger and resentment I've been carrying. Not for her sake, but for mine. I don't want to spend the rest of my life bitter about something that ultimately led to this." She gestured at the ranch, at Sarah sleeping nearby, at Luke beside her. "How can I be angry when I'm this happy?" Luke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I heard Martha died last month, in Kansas. Her heart, apparently. Timothy sent a letter to the sheriff informing him." Eleanor felt a complicated mix of emotions, relief, sadness, something that might have been pity. "Then I can't forgive her in person, but I can let it go anyway. I can choose to remember that she was a bitter, unhappy woman who lashed out from her own pain, and I can be grateful that her worst intentions couldn't destroy the best things in my life." "That's very generous of you," Luke said. "That's very practical of me," Eleanor corrected. "Carrying grudges is exhausting, and I have better things to do with my energy." She squeezed his hand. "Like loving you, raising our daughter, teaching children who need me. Like building a life worth living." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank behind the mountains and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Inside the house, Sarah made a small sound in her sleep, and both parents turned their heads instinctively, that new parent hypervigilance that never quite turned off. But the baby settled back into sleep, and they relaxed. "I got a letter from the territorial governor today," Luke said after a while. "He's looking for recommendations for the new territorial education board. He wants people who understand rural schooling and what children need to succeed in this territory." Eleanor looked at him sharply. "You're not suggesting—" "I'm absolutely suggesting," Luke said, smiling. "Eleanor, you've built something remarkable with that school. Students are thriving, families are grateful, and you've proven that education can work even in remote areas if it's done right. The governor needs people like you advising him on education policy. People who know what they're talking about and aren't afraid to speak truth to power." "I have a 3-month-old baby," Eleanor protested. "I'm barely managing teaching part-time. How could I possibly—" "You'd figure it out," Luke said calmly, "the way you always do. Besides, most of the work would be correspondence and occasional meetings in Denver. Nothing that would require you to be away from Sarah for long. And Eleanor," he turned to face her fully, "you're too smart and too capable to limit yourself to one small schoolroom. You could influence education for the entire territory. Think of all the children you could help." Eleanor felt something kindle in her chest. Ambition, perhaps, or simply the recognition of possibility. She had spent so much of her life playing small, accepting limitations, trying not to draw attention. But Luke was right. She had proven herself. She had built something from nothing. Why shouldn't she dream bigger?
I'll think about it, she said.
That's my girl, Luke said, and kissed her. The years that followed were full and rich in ways Eleanor had never imagined possible. She did accept the position on the Territorial Education Board, and her work helped shape policy that expanded schooling across Colorado. Her own school at the CCC became a model that other communities tried to replicate, and she trained several young teachers who went on to open schools of their own. Sarah grew from infant to toddler to little girl, fierce and curious and bright. She learned to walk by pulling herself up on fence posts and chasing after ranch hands. She learned her letters sitting in her mother's classroom, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. She learned to ride almost before she could run, perched in front of her father on his great bay horse, fearless and laughing. And when Sarah was 3, Eleanor became pregnant again, this time with twins, 2 boys who arrived squalling and red-faced and utterly different from each other from the moment of birth. Thomas was quiet and thoughtful, while James was loud and adventurous, and together they turned the ranch house into a chaos of noise and joy and constant motion. Luke expanded the ranch, buying adjacent properties and increasing his herd. But he never lost sight of what mattered most: the family dinners where they all gathered around the table, the Sunday afternoons spent riding through the high meadows, the quiet evenings when he and Eleanor would sit together after the children were asleep and simply talk, the way they always had. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Luke gave Eleanor a book, not just any book, but a leather-bound journal filled with blank pages. "For your story," he said, "so Sarah and the boys will know someday how we began, how their mother was the bravest, strongest woman I ever met, and how she chose to build a life with me despite having every reason to run the other direction." Eleanor ran her fingers over the smooth leather. "That's not quite how I remember it. I remember you saving me from destruction." "You saved yourself," Luke said firmly. "I just gave you a place to land while you rebuilt. Everything since then, the school, the children, this life we have, that's all you, Eleanor. Your courage, your intelligence, your capacity to love even after you've been hurt. I'm just lucky enough to be part of it." Eleanor looked at her husband, at the silver threading more thickly through his hair now, at the laugh lines deeper around his eyes, at the strength and kindness that had never wavered in 5 years of marriage. "We saved each other," she said. "That's the truth. And we keep saving each other, every day, by choosing to stay, to love, to build together." She did write their story in that journal, filling pages with memories and reflections. She wrote about the terror of that day in the street, the confusion of Luke's intervention, the gradual unfolding of partnership into love. She wrote about Sarah's birth, about the twins' arrival, about the challenges and triumphs of building a school and a family simultaneously. She wrote it all down so their children would understand that love could come from the most unexpected places, that destruction could become creation, that scandal could transform into legacy. The town of Copper Ridge, which had once condemned Eleanor so viciously, eventually came to revere her. She was Mrs. Calhoun now, the rancher's wife, the woman who had built the best school in 3 counties, the mother of 3 beautiful children. People who had whispered about her now sought her advice on everything from education to child rearing to how to navigate social challenges. She had become, improbably, a pillar of the community. Sometimes Eleanor thought about Martha Kane, dead in Kansas, and wondered if the woman had ever found peace. She hoped so, because Eleanor had learned that bitterness only poisoned the bitter person, while forgiveness freed everyone involved. She had learned that the worst thing that ever happened to her had also been the catalyst for the best things. She had learned that strength wasn't about never needing anyone, but about being brave enough to trust when trust seemed impossible. On a crisp October afternoon, 10 years after that fateful day, when her life had been destroyed and rebuilt in the space of minutes, Eleanor stood on the porch of the CCC ranch house and watched her children play in the yard. Sarah, now 9, was teaching the 6-year-old twins to ride, her patience with them exactly the kind of teacher's patience Eleanor had once shown her students. Luke was working with his men near the barn, but his eyes kept finding Eleanor and the children, checking on them with that same protective instinct that had never faded. The school stood in the near distance, a solid structure that had educated hundreds of children over the years. Her classroom was ready for Monday's lessons, her students' assignments graded and waiting. The house behind her was warm and full of love and the comfortable chaos of family life. The ranch stretched in all directions, prosperous and peaceful. Eleanor placed her hand on her belly, where another child was just beginning to make itself known. A surprise pregnancy that she and Luke had greeted with equal parts shock and delight. 4 children, a family, a legacy. This was her life now, built from the ashes of reputation, destroyed and rebuilt stronger. Built from a lie that became truth. Not the lie about pregnancy that had started everything, but the deeper truth that had emerged from it. That she and Luke belonged together. That partnership could become love. That a man's claim of, if she carries, it's mine, could transform into a marriage where everything was shared, everything was mutual, everything was built together. Sarah ran up onto the porch, breathless and laughing. "Mama, did you see? Thomas made it all the way around the corral without help." "I saw, sweetheart. You're an excellent teacher." Sarah beamed, then noticed Eleanor's hand on her stomach. Her eyes went wide. "But, Mama, are you?" Eleanor smiled. "We'll talk about it at dinner. Go play with your brothers." As Sarah raced back to the twins, Eleanor turned to find Luke watching her from across the yard. Even at this distance, she could see the question in his eyes. She nodded, one hand still on her belly, and watched his face transform with joy. He started toward her, that long-legged stride that had carried him into her life all those years ago, and Eleanor went to meet him halfway. They came together in the center of the yard, his arms around her, her head against his chest, both of them laughing because life was absurd and beautiful and far more than either of them had dared to dream. "Another baby," Luke said, pulling back to look at her. "Really? Really?" Eleanor confirmed. "Are you happy?" "I'm everything," Luke said, and kissed her there in full view of the children and the ranch hands and anyone else who cared to watch. Because they had nothing to hide, nothing to prove, nothing but love and partnership, and a life they had built deliberately, one choice at a time. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Eleanor and Luke sat together in the parlor as they had done 1,000 times before. Eleanor's journal lay open on her lap, and she was adding new entries about the day, about the baby to come, about the fullness of their life. Luke read beside her, occasionally reaching over to touch her hand, to remind himself that this was real, that she was real, that everything they had built together was solid and true. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "Taking on someone else's scandal? Binding yourself to me when you could have had anyone?" Luke set down his book and looked at her with those blue eyes that still made her heart skip. "Not for a single second. You're the best decision I ever made, Eleanor Calhoun, and I'd make that claim again in a heartbeat. If she carries, it's mine, because you are mine and I'm yours, and that's the only truth that matters." Eleanor leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and thought about how far they'd come from that desperate day in the street, how a moment of scandal had become a lifetime of love, how a lie had revealed the deepest truth of all, that 2 people could find each other in the most impossible circumstances and build something lasting. Outside, the Colorado night settled over the ranch, vast and starlit and full of promise. Inside, Eleanor and Luke held each other close, their children sleeping peacefully nearby, another child growing between them, and knew that they had won, not against Martha Kane or the gossips or the scandal, but against fear and loneliness and the belief that happiness was impossible. They had won by choosing each other, every day, in every way that mattered, and that victory, built on love and partnership and stubborn determination, would last for all their days and echo through the generations that followed, a legacy more precious than land or cattle or gold. This was their story, the lie that became truth, the scandal that became love, the moment when everything changed and 2 strangers became partners, lovers, friends, and finally, completely and irrevocably, family.